Hi, everyone. This is Phil Travis, and this week's presentation is on the beginnings of World War II in Asia. Now, Japan became a kind of an emergent empire around about the same time the United States became an emergent empire. Both the United States and the Japanese were sort of a little bit late to the game, later 19th century empires. And Japan's empire really begins to emerge in the 1890s and through the World War I period. Japan had the old Tokugawa shogunate had been ended in decades before, and Japan, under the Meiji Restoration, began to develop as a major international power. Now, after the Sino-Japanese War with China in 1895, Japan annexed Taiwan, and then in 1915, Japan annexed Korea. After World War I, Western powers like the United States, particularly, very much began to be somewhat concerned with the emergence of Japan as a major imperial naval power. For the United States, that was a direct, or at least a potential threat to the United States. Both Japan and the United States were emergent empires, more or less, in the same general area, and that was in the Pacific, in Asia. And so at the Washington Naval Conference of 1921, the United States, Japan, and Great Britain, most notably, agreed to naval limitations. These were particularly limitations on the tonnage of battleships in the Navy, in each navies. And interestingly, the United States was able to get Japan to accept a lower tonnage. The ratio was 553, so the battleship tonnage for the British and the United States was effectively equal, whereas Japan was convinced to accept a smaller tonnage of battleships for battleships, meaning their navy would be smaller. And interestingly, the United States did that in part by sort of listening in on Japanese messages and learning where the Japanese sort of breaking point was on the negotiation. The Japanese found out about that, and it continued to be the beginning of a deterioration of relations between the United States and Japan as we moved towards World War II. In Japan, at the end of the 1920s, early 1930s, with the onset of the Depression, you had competing factions. You had factions that insisted that Japan needed to become an overseas empire, and you had factions that insisted that Japan needed to focus more domestically. With the emergence of the Depression, Japan is going to effectively, increasingly be dominated by a militarist leadership that was bent on creating a major overseas empire for Japan, on using resources and military efforts to make Japan a great imperial power. And Japan promoted this like other powers with propaganda. This poster you see here is a propaganda poster depicting the Greater Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere, which was promoted by the Japanese leadership. And of course, what this implies is that together, if they support Japan, Japan will become a great empire, and it will somehow be good for all Asians, and it will push the European powers out of Asia. In truth, this was all propaganda, and the reality is that the Japanese would become just as brutal and destructive and manipulative and militaristic as the European powers that they were pushing out. In 1931, in a lot of respects, the war begins with the invasion of Manchuria. Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931 for a few reasons. But primarily, these reasons were related to resources. If Japan was to become an empire, Japan needed natural resources. The island of Japan lacks the types of resources that countries like the United States possess. And so, in order to become an empire, you need coal, you need iron ore, you need these things to become an empire, to fuel your machine, the imperial machine. And so, Japan had already expanded into Korea. Manchuria, which borders Korea, was a natural area of expansion. Manchuria also possessed important resources, particularly coal, that the Japanese could use, and Manchuria also provided a key position for Japan to move on China, which was part of its overall sort of vision, which would possess a great agricultural space for the Japanese people. And here pictured is Hideki Tojo, who was the head of the so-called Kwantung Army, which was the Japanese army in Manchuria, which became a huge army centered and headquartered in Manchuria, and the army that was primarily used for attacks in Mongolia as well as the invasion of China. Japan invaded China in 1937. It was a hugely controversial moment that began with the so-called China Incident of July 7th, 1937. Sometimes also referred to as the incident at the Marco Polo Bridge. There was intensive hostilities between, or there were great tensions between China under the leadership of Chiang Kai-shek and, of course, the Japanese. And the Japanese effectively provoked an exchange intentionally between the Chinese and the Japanese at the Marco Polo Bridge, a 12th century bridge in northern China. And the Japanese used this as a kind of justification for an invasion of China. The primary purpose for the invasion of China is a need for resources, food for their army and population, and other resources. And if you look on the map here, the shaded kind of orangish color or reddish color refers to the Japanese Empire in China, and of course in the south you see it's a little bit more sparse, and you see Taiwan there, and Manchuria is up to the north, bordering Korea. Interestingly, at this time, the Germans, Nazi Germany and Japan have an agreement. It's the so-called Anti-Comintern Agreement, which was basically the Anti-Communist Pact. Nazi Germany and Japan basically had signed an agreement that that guaranteed that both would seek to fight communism in the world. And to the Japanese and the Germans, this was kind of a sort of anti-Soviet Union sort of pact, right? Germany, however, really encouraged Japan to attack European territories rather than China itself. And Japan does not really heed that kind of encouragement. Now, why? One might ask why. Why would Nazi Germany not just encourage Japan to, take over all of China? Why would they want to encourage them to just attack other European territories? Well, the answer is kind of simple. One, of course, Hitler is going to be fighting European powers, so whittling away at their empire was advantageous. But most significantly was the simple fact that the relationship between the Japanese and the Nazis was not, it wasn't like they were, super close. It was really more of a relationship of convenience. And Hitler, who was interested in creating, a powerful global empire, wanted to make sure that if relations turned between the Japanese and the Germans, that Japan would not be too powerful. And so this was partly out of a desire by the Germans to try and limit the full expansion of Japan as an empire in case relations fell off. In this invasion, this was a very, very controversial invasion, though, like what you see in Europe, the United States and the Allied powers really do little more than wave a finger at Japan. There's not an effort to actually take action against Japan. Instead, the United States has a lot of strong talk about Japan shouldn't be in China and these types of things. And in 1937, we actually had, a riverboat, the Panay, sunk by the Japanese unintentionally. And this was hugely controversial, but ultimately, we accepted basically a small indemnity payment and an apology, and we were fine with that. Um, and that was largely because the United States was really being dominated by isolationist attitudes. Many in the United States don't want to be involved overseas in conflicts. And so the United States, at the time, dealing with the latter stages of the Depression, was really uninterested in doing anything more than, having a stern word for the Japanese after the sinking of the Panay in 1937. Now, the Japanese invasion of China remains throughout the war one of the most brutal and destructive events in the war. The author of our textbook insists that World War II was unique, particularly because it was a war of annihilation. And you see this war of annihilation, meaning a war that was not simply about military targets. It wasn't simply about aspects of a military campaign. It was about totally annihilating the opponent, both their civilian populace, their cities, as well as their military capabilities. You really see the sort of war of total annihilation first in China in 1937. And there's many examples of this, but probably the most noteworthy example is the so-called Rape of Nanjing. In China, the Japanese used prisoners as live bayonet practice. They conducted a myriad of brutal human atrocities on the people that included even recreational rape. And what that term recreational rape means is that effectively the soldiers were raping women, with unchecked abandon, largely just because it was something to do. And then they saw the Chinese people in a similar way that the Germans saw people of Eastern Europe. They saw the Chinese people as lesser people and unafforded the kind of rights that a human should be afforded. And as a result of that, they violated those rights wantonly. Again, live humans for bayonet practice, massive cases of rape, in some cases in front of small children. Ultimately, Japan's expressed goal for China was to depopulate the countryside and to punish those who were left alive. And then the goal would be ultimately to use that depopulated countryside to serve and feed the Japanese Empire. The Japanese, the Japanese, militarily speaking, compared to their counterparts, really in all cases, the Japanese were technologically really not as prepared or advanced as their opponents. I mean, they built airplanes like the Zero. They built some tanks, and but generally speaking, even their artillery, generally speaking, these technologies were somewhat behind the other European powers by about a decade. They were less effective. Their military equipment was generally less effective. Now, an exception to this would be their navy. The Japanese had a highly impressive navy, and in fact, they built, for example, the Yamamoto-class battleships, which were really the largest battleships ever built. So their navy was highly impressive, but in terms of their army, they really were technologically, relatively inferior technologically to the Soviets, the United States, the Germans, and so forth. And the Japanese, what they believed is that would really be their strength would be the sort of passionate preparedness, the nationalism, the training of Japanese armed forces. That the Japanese sort of passionate, sort of gung-ho Japanese soldier that was trained amid the Bushido Code would basically outweigh the disadvantages of their military equipment. The Bushido Code, of course, went back to the age of the samurais, and this was, of course, the code that insisted that honor in battle was the ultimate, and that surrender was unacceptable and tantamount to dishonor. And this Bushido Code leads ultimately in the war, especially when it goes south of the Japanese, to the usage of last-ditch kamikazes, the pilots that would fly planes into ships, banzai suicide charges, and in some cases even suicide of officers facing defeat. What you're looking at in this picture here is a picture that I took when I was in Okinawa, and this wall is pockmarked with the shards of hand grenades that the Japanese officers used to commit suicide rather than be captured by the Americans in the battle. The policy outlook of the Japanese is like this. The United States is their primary competitor, and they very much see that ultimately in the process of becoming a great empire, Japan was going to have to face the United States. And so they build a high-tech navy, and they very much rely on this navy to ultimately be the key to trying to prevent or trying to defeat the United States before the United States can prevent the consolidation of the Japanese empire. So let me put this up here. So so at the outset of the war, it's this interesting thing. Americans, we tend to sometimes, if we don't study this history, we tend to think, oh, well, Pearl Harbor just came out of the blue. And yes, December 7th, 1941, that Sunday morning, was certainly a sneak attack. However, Pearl Harbor was something, or not necessarily Pearl Harbor itself, but a war in Pacific with Japan, the Japanese, was something that the Japanese and the United States had actually been preparing for upwards of a decade. The United States had developed something long before Pearl Harbor called War Plan Orange. And War Plan Orange was basically the war plan for how we were going to deal with a war with Japan in the Pacific. And likewise, the Japanese had created their own war plan designed to counter our War Plan Orange. So both sides had sort of created these war plans for effectively how to deal with the other when the almost seemingly inevitable imperial war between the United States and Japan began. The goal of the Japanese was to effectively consolidate their control on islands extending out in the Pacific. Their goal first was to engage the United States Navy in kind of far off reaches of the Pacific, and then culminate that in a major naval battle that would effectively eliminate the United States Pacific Fleet and make it more or less impossible for the United States to retool fast enough to prevent the Japanese from consolidating control on Pacific islands. They believed that the United States would not be able to, after a major climactic naval battle, they believed that the United States would not be able to kind of unseat them after they consolidated their control on the Pacific islands. Of course, like the Germans, they hugely underestimated the capabilities of their opponent. And this here is a look. You're looking at the caves of Okinawa. This, of course, we'll talk about this battle when we get towards the end of the class. But this battle was the climactic battle, in the Pacific, really, in 1945. And Okinawa is an island made of coral, and so these caves were all, chiseled out of the coral stone, if you will. And it's actually quite an impressive thing to see if you ever get a chance to visit Okinawa. These caves are pretty phenomenal. So the Japanese and the Soviet Union actually fought each other at the beginning of the war. And a lot of people don't know this. And this, of course, is before the Nazis invade the Soviet Union in 1941. This was sort of an undeclared sideshow type of thing. But it was a really significant first moment, in the war. The Japanese were placing pressure on the area of Outer Mongolia, and you see that depicted here on the map below. This area was known as Nomonhan for the Japanese, and generally it's geographically the region of the Khalkhin Gol region. And these are generally known as the battles of Khalkhin Gol. The Japanese pressure in Outer Mongolia concerned Stalin. Stalin feared that the Japanese were threatening the Trans-Siberian Railroad, which was the only way that the Soviet Union could effectively transport people from the west to the east. And so as a result of that, Stalin brought in one of his great generals, General Georgy Zhukov. And General Zhukov will repel the Japanese rather decisively. And it's a very significant moment because General Zhukov he's the first individual to use tanks, Air Force, and artillery together in a combined offensive. And why is that significant? Very soon we're going to talk about the German Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War. And while Zhukov it wasn't exactly Blitzkrieg in the sense that the Germans used it, it was very much a precursor to, the German use of what's called Lightning War or Blitzkrieg, which were very, very quick attacks spearheaded by armored panzer divisions, autonomous tank divisions that were supported with heavy air support. Zhukov effectively used a variation of this. It was the first time that tanks, Air Force, and artillery had been used in a consolidated way for offensive. The Soviets really routed the Japanese, who had inferior equipment, and the Japanese from this point really choose to focus their efforts on China and focus more towards on the actual Pacific theater of operations as opposed to fighting in the interior of Eastern Asia. On June 1940, the two countries, Japan and the Soviet Union, will sign a border agreement. Just before that, the Nazis had signed with the Soviet Union what's called the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact, which we will talk about, or sometimes this is referred to as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. The Nazi-Soviet non-aggression agreement really angered the Japanese because the Japanese had an anti-communist agreement with Germany. They had the Anti-Comintern Pact. And that pact basically agreed between Germany and Japan that the two would both fight the communists. But now, of course, the Hitler and the Nazis had gone and turned and actually signed an agreement with the Soviet Union, the very country that the Anti-Comintern Pact was supposed to be, from the Japanese perspective, an alliance against. Of course, we know now that, Hitler's whole intent was to invade the Soviet Union for the purpose of creating Lebensraum, or living space, for the German people. We know that he created that non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union for the purposes of effectively setting the Soviet Union up for invasion after the invasion of Poland. But as a result of that, the Anti-Comintern Pact with Japan dissolved, and the Japanese signed a neutrality agreement with the Soviet Union that lasted from 1940 to 1945. And it wasn't rescinded until the very end of the war, when the United States began asking the Soviet Union for help in fighting the Japanese in Asia after the conclusion of the European theater of war. So the Soviet Union and the Japanese, despite these engagements in the Battle of Khalkhin Gol in the late 1930s to 1940, the Soviet Union and the Japanese were actually neutral and were no longer at war. Okay, well, I think we'll stop there. I hope this is helpful, and I hope it makes sense, and let's have a great week.